he's about, and I hope it'll be a very productive day, discussing the dialogue for a sustainable economy. And we're very lucky to have Phil Law with us. I'm just going to say a few words about Phil Law. He is one of Australia's leading ecological economists, and he's come over from Adelaide, South Australia. He's currently affiliated with the Centre for Full Employment and Equity at the University of Newcastle, Australia. He's also a research fellow with the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and a member of the Wakefield Futures Group. I think it says it there. He's an author and editor of 8 books on sustainable development and steady-state economy, with 55 journal articles. So obviously he is a leading ecological economist, and we're lucky to get him today. And has his articles appeared in more than 40 books, published books. And he, of course, regularly appears for public events and debates, and this is one of those events. So, without further ado, I'll give you Phil Law.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that introduction, and thank you very much for giving the opportunity to speak today. My presentation, so basically the aim of my presentation today is to put forward a case for making the transition away from our obsession with growth, sometimes referred to as growth mania, to a steady state economy. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term steady state economy, but basically a steady state economy is a physically non-growing economy. So you have a steady state economy, it's an economy that's no longer growing. And by that I mean that it's an economy where the quantity of physical goods or wealth, and of course the human beings that remain part of it, are constant over time. So the stock of physical goods remains constant over time. So why do we need to make this transition to a steady state economy? Well, I'm going to speak for about 50-55 minutes, but if there's one thing I'd like you to leave this place remembering is this notion that the underlying cause of most of our problems, whether they be economic, social and or ecological, is our obsession with growth. It's the elephant in the room. It really is the elephant in the room. So the majority of our most pressing ecological, social and economic problems are not so much problems in themselves, they're really symptoms of a much larger problem. And that larger underlying problem is our obsession or our addiction with growth. So we need a conversation about the undesirable impact of our growth obsession. We need people to be sceptical every time you hear someone, whether it be a politician, academic or what have you, calls for more growth. Virtually all the conversations that you hear talking about sustainability, what have you, focus on doing things differently, trying to do things better. And of course it's always a desirable thing to do things better because in some cases we're doing things worse than we used to. But it's the scale at which we're doing things, whether that's for better or for worse, that's the real problem. That's the real key. It's the scale at which we're doing things that matters. Okay, so it's important that we do things better, move towards renewable resources, away from non-renewable resources, greater levels of recycling and so forth, but it's the scale at which we do things which is the real killer. Okay, so we can do things as best as possible, but if we do it on a grand scale, it still will be unsustainable. So because of growth, the growth that we've been experiencing for some time, the scale at which we're doing things continues to rise. So because of growth, the scale of everything that we're doing is rising over time. As a consequence, many new social and ecological or economic problems are emerging, and virtually all our environmental problems are intensifying. So to help me with my discussion today, I'm going to use an identity, a little equation. Don't want to put too much mathematics into the presentation, but it's, you've probably heard of Paul Ehrlich, the famous American biologist, ecologist. His IPAT identity, I want to use that to explain or justify the reason for the transition to a steady state economy. And this IPAT identity or equation, the I in the IPAT formula is just environmental impact. So I is environmental impact. And that's basically a function of the rate of resource use. The more resources we use, the greater is the environmental impact, for obvious reasons. The more resources we use, the more resources we extract from the natural environment, the more we interfere with the natural environment, the more we interfere with natural ecological processes and so forth. So if resource use goes up, environmental impact goes up. Okay, so what's the P in the identity? That's population. So P is population. A in the identity is affluence. And by affluence I mean per capita gross domestic product. You're probably familiar with the term gross domestic product. That's basically the quantity of real output being produced by the economy. So if per capita GDP goes up, it means averaged across the population, the quantity of real output is rising. And because that's simply GDP divided by the population. So per capita GDP is the total GDP, total real output, divided by population. So affluence is reflected by the per capita GDP. And T is technology. And because we're talking about beneficial technology in a broader sense. Okay? And if you've got improvements or increases in beneficial forms of technology, it means you're going to be reducing the resource intensity of economic activity. Well, it means that the quantity of resources that you're going to be using for every dollar of GDP that's generated is going to fall. So when you've got beneficial technology, you're reducing the resource intensity of economic activity, you're reducing the resources you're using to produce a dollar's worth of GDP. Okay? So I is basically equal to P times A times T. So given that, the identity just looks a little bit different, but it's basically I, there's P for population, A affluence times, well that's, as I said, is GDP per capita, which is GDP times population, times technology, beneficial technology, which is resources, R just represents resource use, divided by GDP. So ideally you want the R over GDP to be falling. You want all of them to be falling if you want environmental impact to be falling. And if R over GDP is falling, as I said before, that means you're using fewer resources to produce a dollar's worth of GDP. And as I said, environmental impact is a function of the quantity of resources that you're using. So, you know, if I don't know how well you know your maths or what have you, but if I just divide it through the population and the GDP, I'd be left with I is a function of R. Okay? So if we do things better, as I mentioned before, it's important that we do things better. Basically that means that we would be reducing the resource intensity of GDP. Okay? Which is reflected by R over GDP, which is representative of T for technology. If we reduced, so we lowered this, so this came down, and everything else remained unchanged, that would reduce environmental impact. And just to give you a nice little hypothetical example here, let's assume that the population is 1 million people. We've got 1 million people. We're going to assume that the quantity of resource use is 10 billion tonnes of resources being used per year. We're using 10 billion tonnes of resources per year. GDP is $20 billion. So we're producing $20 billion worth of GDP per year. All right, so we put that into our identity. P is going to be 1 million people. Okay. A, remember, is GDP divided by population, it's per capita GDP. That would be $20 billion, our GDP, divided by the population of 1 million people. That would be $20,000 per person. So per capita GDP, if you had a GDP of $20 billion, 1 million people, per capita GDP would be $20,000 per person. And T would be R over GDP. Okay, that would be 10 billion tonnes of resources. I said we're using 10 billion tonnes of resources, divided by $20 billion of GDP. So that means that we'd be using half a tonne, 0.5 tonnes, half a tonne of resources per dollar of GDP produced. That would be the resource intensity of economic activity. Half a tonne of resources for every dollar of GDP produced. And because we can just put those into the equation. So I would be equal to 1 million people times your $20,000 per capita GDP times your 0.5, and that would be, gives you your 10 billion tonnes of resources being used per year. So let's just say that's the current situation. Okay, We then protest in the streets. We lobby our politicians to do things better. When we do things better, remember T falls, we reduce the resource intensity of economic activity. And so T falls from, instead of 0.5 tonnes of resources per every dollar of GDP being produced, it falls to 0.4 tonnes. So we reduce the resource intensity of GDP. Okay. We'll assume there's no growth in population and no growth in GDP. What does that mean? Okay, we put the numbers into our equation. Still have 1 million people. Our per capita GDP is still $20,000. But of course, we're not multiplying by 0.5 anymore. It's 0.4. We've reduced the resource intensity of economic activity such that we're only using 0.4 of a tonne of resources to produce $1 worth of GDP. So overall, we're now using 8 billion tonnes of resources. So resource use has gone down. As long as population stays the same, as long as per capita GDP stays the same, if we reduce the resource intensity of economic activity, then the quantity of resources goes down, and of course it means our environmental impact falls. Wonderful, fantastic. Problem is, what happens if in the meantime we fail to protest to prevent growth in both population and GDP, and in that time it takes to reduce T from half a tonne to 0.4 of a tonne, population increases to 1.5 million, and per capita GDP increases from $20,000 to $25,000. What happens? Right, put the new numbers in. I is going to be equal to, it's not 1 million people now, it's now 1.5 million people. It's not $20,000 per person of GDP, it's $25,000 per person. Of course, we've reduced the resource intensity from half a tonne to 0.4 of a tonne. You multiply that through, we're now using 15 billion tonnes of resources. We've now increased the quantity of resources that are being used, even though we've reduced the resource intensity of economic activity. So I has increased, environmental impact has increased. So doing things better reduces T, that's a desirable thing, but it does nothing, doing things better by itself does nothing to reduce P and A, population and affluence, both of which increase as a consequence of growth. So because of our growth obsession, A and P are going up. So that even if T, when we protest in the streets, when we argue for movement towards renewables and doing things, recycling, reducing waste and so forth, we still have an increase in the resources being used, we still have an increase in environmental impact. It's growth that is the problem. It's the scale at which we're doing things. When P and A go up, the scale at which we do things goes up. So even though we do things better, because the scale at which we're doing things goes up sufficiently, we still have greater environmental impact. So yes, we need to do something about T, but we need to do something about P and A. What's been happening at the global level, which has largely been replicated at the national level. So what's been happening to P, population, at the global level? What's been happening to A, per capita gross world product, so it's called gross domestic product at the national level. At the global level, it's referred to as gross world product. What's been happening to T at the global level? So what's happening to global resource use per dollar of gross world product being produced, and therefore what has been happening to environmental impact at the global level, which of course if we're interested in environmental impact, more particularly we're interested in what's happening to resource use. We're assuming here if resource use goes up, environmental impact goes up. So what's happening to resource use at the global level? Okay, we need, in my little example I had earlier, I said so many tonnes of resources being used. We do have an indicator that gives us some idea of the resources that we're using. It's called the ecological footprint. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the ecological footprint, but basically the ecological footprint represents the area of land that's required. The key word there is required to generate the resources that we use, to absorb the wastes that we generate, and to provide the critical ecosystem services that are needed to sustain economic activity at its current level. So basically the ecological footprint represents our resource demands, our demands on the planet. If ecological footprint goes up, our demands on the planet are going up, meaning we're using more resources, meaning our environmental impact is rising. Okay, so what's been happening at the global level? Okay, so let's look at T. Remember, that's part of our formula, IPAT formula, T. Okay, that was resources, R divided by GDP. Well, we're now using ecological footprint to represent resource use, so it's ecological footprint divided by gross world product. Well, that's been going down. We want that to go down, so that's a good thing. So it means that we have been doing, at the global level, many things better. In fact, if you have a look at it, the T has actually, this is from 1961 to 2014, so it's a little bit dated, it's about 5 years out of date, but to give you some idea of what's happened largely over the last 50 or so years, it's halved. So T is halved. That basically means that to produce $1 worth of gross world product in 2014, we use half as many resources as we did in 1961. We use half, in 2004 we're using half as many resources to produce $1. Remember, that's just $1 worth of gross world product in 2014 compared to 1961. Okay, what's been happening to population? P in the formula. Well, that's been going up. In fact, it was in 1961 just above 3 billion people. It, by 2014, was close to 7.5 billion people. It more than doubled. And it's now around about 7.8 billion. So P has been rising. What's been happening to A? Per capita gross world product. That's also been rising. In fact, it's more than doubled. So per capita gross world product in 1961 was just under $4,000. By 2014, it was just above $10,000. So that's been rising. So T's been going down, A's been going up, and P's been going up. So what's the overall effect? So we've got P going up, we've got A going up, and T going down. We multiply that through, I's going up. The environmental impact is going up, as represented by the ecological footprint, and this is the ecological footprint at the global level. In fact, the global ecological footprint between 1961 and 2014 increased threefold. Our environmental impact at the global level has gone up threefold, despite the fact that we're using half as many resources to produce $1 worth of gross world product. We're doing things better, to some extent we could do things a lot better, but it's the scale effect of the growing population and growing per capita gross world product that's overwhelming the impact of reducing T, doing things better, and resulting in environmental impact rising. It's growth that's the real killer. Because if P and A had have remained flat across the 53-year period with the fall in T, I would have fallen. But it has risen. The worst of all, not only is the environmental impact rising, it's at the global level, ecological footprint now exceeds the so-called biocapacity of the planet, so that economic activity at the global level is ecologically unsustainable. In fact, the global ecological footprint exceeded the planet's biocapacity by 70%. Okay, what do I mean by biocapacity? I defined ecological footprint as the area of land that was required. When we're talking about the biocapacity of the planet, we're talking about the area of land that's available, right, to generate the resources, to absorb the wastes, and to provide critical ecosystem services and so forth. Okay. So at the global level, biocapacity basically represents the Earth's capacity to generate resources on a sustainable basis. So the biocapacity reflects ecologically sustainable resource supplies. So if you have a situation where the ecological footprint is greater than biocapacity, remember ecological footprint was resource demands, biocapacity is resource supplies. So if ecological footprint exceeds biocapacity, means what we demand from the planet is exceeding what the planet can supply for us, means that you're unsustainable. You've got an ecological deficit. And of course, if you've got an ecological deficit, it means that the economy, which relies upon that inflow of resources, is larger than what can be ecologically sustained. It's larger than its maximum sustainable scale. So all I've got here, this blue line, is the ecological footprint that I had before, but I've also now included global biocapacity. And you can see that since 1970, at a global level, we've been in ecological deficit. The ecological footprint started exceeding global biocapacity our resource demands at the global level started exceeding resource supplies that the planet could supply for us since 1970. So you could say up to 1970 at the global level we were operating sustainably, but since 1970 we've been operating unsustainably. And you can see that that gap between ecological footprint and biocapacity is rising. In fact, if you convert, then you might ask, why has the biocapacity been going up? Well, that's just through better resource management, development of new crop strains and what have you, which means that we're able to produce a bit more from the land that is available. But it's, as you can see, the biocapacity hasn't gone up much, and it certainly hasn't gone up as much as ecological footprint. So if I convert it, because the biocapacity at any point in time really just reflects what one planet can supply for us. So if I say biocapacity is one planet, then ecological footprint's up here at 1.7. So basically what that is saying, so in 2014, we needed 1.7 Earths to sustain our current rate of resource use. So you can use resources at a rate that's unsustainable, but you can't keep doing it. You can use resources at a rate greater than what the planet can sustainably provide or supply, but only by running down the stock of natural capital, cutting down the trees, not so much cutting down the trees, but depleting resource stocks, depleting fish stocks and so forth. Right, so the global economy is 70% larger than its maximum sustainable scale. So what's the required response? Okay, well, all countries clearly need to do things much better. And an example of that would be a shift away from non-renewable to renewable resources, to increase the rate at which we reduce T in the formula. That was technology, that was the resource intensity of economic activity. Now that was falling, but we need that perhaps to fall at a faster rate. Note there are limits to reducing T. I won't go into that in any great detail, but there's a limit to how much you can reduce T. Right? To produce $1 worth of GDP, there's a limit to how much you can reduce the resources that you need to produce that $1 worth of GDP. What about rich countries? Well, rich countries need to limit their increases in A. Remember, A was per capita GDP. Right, so the per capita GDP of rich countries is more than enough to live a decent life. The per capita GDP of Australia is more than enough for every Australian to live a decent life. People say, well, there are some people who are struggling. Well, that's just telling you that we're not distributing the GDP equitably. There's more than enough to go around, more than enough. So distribution of GDP is important. In a sustainable world, if we do move towards sustainability, distribution is going to be more important than ever. In fact, one of the reasons it's been suggested that we have this obsession with growth is it allows us, in the meantime, before ecosystems collapse, to avoid the issue of distribution. Just don't worry about it, it's too hard. Just grow the economy and hope enough of the GDP trickles down to people who are poor. We can't rely upon that because it's unsustainable. Well, it's not trickling down enough anyway, but we're even more restricted if we move towards, in terms of GDP, if we move towards a sustainable economy, and that means distribution becomes more important than ever. And of course, distribution of GDP is important, yet inequality is growing. The last 35 years in Australia, the gap between rich and poor has been growing, whereas in the 35-year period after World War II, the gap was narrowing. Some countries like Australia need to address rises in P, population. So most rich countries have very, very low population growth rates. Japan, in fact, it's slightly falling. Places like Italy and what have you, it's pretty much zero population growth. But we still have countries like Australia, Canada, where population is rising. So some rich countries do need to do something about their population, but certainly need to do something about increases in aid. If we have to limit the increase in aid, rich countries are the countries that should be doing it. Because rich countries have got enough per capita GDP for everyone to live a decent life. What about poor countries? Well, they need increases in aid. They do need increases in per capita GDP because some of them are impoverished. So if poor countries are going to experience an increase in aid, the global environmental impact of increases in aid would be lessened if poor countries' per capita GDP rose, if rich countries stabilised their per capita GDP. And by stabilising per capita GDP, of course, we're talking about moving towards a steady state economy. So if countries like Australia move towards a steady state economy, we've got enough GDP to go around. That means that any increase in aid that poor countries need to experience and enjoy, maybe for the next 20, 30 years, before they then move towards a steady state economy, would lessen the environmental impact. Poor countries need to do something about population growth. They're the countries that need to do most about population growth, since many of them experience some of the highest population growth rates on Earth. So they need to limit and ultimately stabilise P. Globally, so just talking about countries generally, we desperately need to do something about population. I know it's an issue that a lot of people like to avoid. Sometimes discussions and debates about population result in people who want population control for all the wrong reasons, for racist, bigoted reasons. This is not an argument for doing something about population on ethnic grounds. Okay, this is to save the planet. So that means, you know, controlling the growth of white people as well as people of colour. Okay. In fact, yeah, we should never entertain the ideas of racist, bigoted people and their efforts to control population. Population should be controlled for environmental reasons. The reason why we need to control P is because the world's population is increasing at the rate of around 80 million people a year, and that's about 1 billion people every 12 to 13 years. I'd say in 12, 13 years' time there'll be an extra billion people. It won't be 7.8 billion, it'll be 8.8 billion. In my lifetime, 55 years, global population has increased from 3.4 billion to 7.8 billion. It's more than doubled just in my lifetime. And the United Nations is forever revising the expected peak global population upwards. So only about 20, 25 years ago, the United Nations was predicting that global population would level out at 9 billion. Now they're saying 11 billion. And so that expectation of where the population is going to peak is rising. So who knows what it might be in 10 years' time? It could be 12 billion. We need to limit increases in aid per capita GDP by having rich countries immediately move to a steady state economy. The rich countries of the world need to move to a steady state economy now. In fact, they should have started some time ago. Which would allow increases in aid to occur in poor nations where it's needed. Remember, A is per capita GDP. We need to further reduce T. That is, we need to further reduce the resource intensity and waste intensity of the economy, of economic activity. But importantly, even if we succeed in reducing T, reducing the resource and waste intensity of economic activity, of GDP, if we do nothing about P&A, population and per capita GDP, environmental impact at the global level will continue to rise, and the global ecological footprint will continue to grow beyond biocapacity. That gap between ecological footprint and biocapacity, that will just continue to grow, and that's simply unsustainable. If we do nothing about P&A, we're doomed, pretty much. So our only hope is the transition to a steady state economy, a non-growing economy. That's the only way you can stabilise P&A, is to move, remember, steady state economy means constant stock of physical goods and human beings. Right? Constant stock of physical goods would mean you would stabilise A, per capita GDP, and you'd be stabilising P population. Provided we reduce T and we stabilise P&A, we'll be able to reduce the environmental impact. So if we go back to our formula, we can keep this constant, so that's not changing, and that constant, we reduce T, multiply that through, our environmental impact will fall. Remember, that's rising because these are rising, even though that's falling. And if we keep doing that, eventually the ecological footprint will fall below biocapacity, and the global economy will again be ecologically sustainable. We'll have an ecological surplus. We'll be back, from an ecological point of view, where we were before 1970, when we actually had an ecological surplus, when the biocapacity of the planet exceeded ecological footprint. Now, I did mention before that there are limits to our ability to reduce T, the resource intensity of economic activity. If that's the case, we may have to reduce, not just stabilise P and A, we may actually have to reduce population and per capita GDP to some extent. That's sometimes referred to in the literature as degrowth. You might have heard that term, degrowth. If that's the case, then it will be the rich countries which will have to do the reduction in aid. So we may actually have to forego some GDP, per capita GDP. But again, there is more than enough real output in a country like Australia for every Australian to live a decent life. So a reduction in per capita GDP in Australia would not be the end of the world. We wouldn't expect poor countries to have to reduce their per capita GDP. They're currently impoverished. But the poor, high population growth countries will have to do the majority of the reduction in population. They're the countries with the high population growth rates. They're the countries that are going to have to do something about their population growth. So the obvious response to this is, won't a transition to a steady state economy, which implies no more increases in A, per capita GDP, mean that human betterment will come to an end? Does that mean the end of human development, what have you? Well, the first thing that needs to be recognised is that it's a mistake to believe that increases in A, that's per capita GDP, automatically mean we're better off. Doesn't necessarily mean that because per capita... Well, put it this way, Australia's per capita GDP has doubled in the last 40 years. Does that mean the average Australian is twice as better off as they were 40 years ago? Of course they weren't. So per capita GDP is not an accurate reflection of our well-being. Secondly, a steady state economy would not be static, it wouldn't be dull, and it wouldn't be stultifying. It would still be dynamic. Okay, so even if you've got a steady population of physical goods that are not growing, we consume the goods. We use some of the durable goods. They wear out through use. They have to be replaced. That's called consumption. There will always have to be some production to replace the goods that we consume and we wear out over time. Right, so even if you're maintaining a steady population of goods, you'll have goods that will become waste as they are consumed or fully depreciate, and we need to add to the stock of goods through production. So there'll be some production, okay, to offset the consumption. But as long as production is equal to consumption, the total stock of goods will remain the same. Well, okay, if we can ensure that the quality of the new goods is superior to the goods that become waste, then the overall quality of the stock improves over time. We can be better off. We don't need more goods to be better off. In fact, you can be worse off by having more goods that are useless. The same quantity of more useful goods will make you better off. A larger quantity of useless goods can make you worse off. So there's plenty of scope for qualitative improvement within a steady state economy, and there's plenty of scope for human betterment. So what happens to economic welfare as GDP grows? I want to make this point clear because this will give you some idea as to how we can increase our well-being even within the context of a steady state economy. Okay, just for the moment, let's just assume that we're going to have a period of time where there's no technological progress. The only thing that's going to happen is GDP is going to grow. We're going to grow in the GDP. What would we expect to happen to the benefits of that extra GDP? Well, we'd expect benefits to go up, got more GDP. But we'd expect them to increase at a diminishing rate. What about the costs of increasing the GDP? That comes at a cost. We have to use resources and so forth. We would expect the cost to go up, but at an increasing rate. So the benefits would go up at a diminishing rate. The reason why the benefits would go up at a diminishing rate is the more goods you're consuming, okay, then the less extra benefit you get from an additional unit of consumption. So, for example, a very wealthy person who's consuming a lot of goods, okay, so the wealthiest person in Australia enjoys a $100 increase in consumption per week. Is that going to add much to that person's well-being? We're talking the wealthiest person in Australia, an extra $100 worth of consumption. Basically, none at all. What about a poor person? It's going to add a lot to their well-being. So the wealthier you become, the less better off, the lower are the smaller are the additional benefits from extra consumption. You get a lot more additional benefit from additional consumption if you're poor than if you're rich. Okay, so as your GDP grows and you get richer, the benefits will increase, but at a diminishing rate. Because you don't get as much extra benefit from the consumption as you get richer as GDP grows. We would expect the cost to go up at an increasing rate. Now, this idea of benefits increasing at a diminishing rate and costs increasing at an increasing rate is consistent with mainstream economics. So there's nothing controversial about this. I'm just using, in this instance, standard mainstream economics. Okay, so economic welfare, if we're interested in what's happening to economic welfare as GDP rises, economic welfare is equal to the sum of benefits minus the sum of costs. So when you do something, it generates benefits and you incur costs. And your economic welfare will be the difference between benefits and costs. That makes sense? You add the benefits, you add the costs, you subtract the costs from the benefits, and the difference is your economic welfare. Okay? So just bear that in mind. Okay, so in this little diagram, I hope this is not too complicated. Imagine this is GDP going, when we're going in this direction, is rising. GDP is rising. So as you move along, this horizontal axis means your GDP is rising. Okay. What's happening to benefits? This blue line represents benefits. They go up as GDP rises, the benefits go up, but at a diminishing rate. What's happening to costs? They go up, but at an increasing rate. Now remember, economic welfare is the difference between benefits and costs. So if you want to know what the economic welfare is for a given level of GDP, so that GDP there, I've picked that one out. Economic welfare will be, you draw a dotted line up, it will be that gap there. That's the difference between benefits and costs at that level of GDP. And you can see that as you grow the GDP, the benefits, so between 0 and GDP star, that the benefits are going up faster than the costs. That gap, so as you grow the GDP, that gap will be getting bigger and would reach a maximum there. So growth between 0 and GDP star is what ecological economists call economic growth. It's economic because it's increasing benefits faster than it's increasing costs. It's increasing our economic welfare. It's economic growth. Economic welfare is maximised here. Growth beyond GDP, well, we still have positive economic welfare, but it's now falling. Beyond this GDP here, the benefits are going up, the costs are now starting to go up at a faster rate than the benefits. So the gap between benefits and GDP at any level of GDP is now shrinking. Ecological economists refer to growth in GDP beyond that level of GDP, where the economic welfare is maximised, as uneconomic growth. That's when growth becomes uneconomic. So in fact there's an economic limit to growth, not just an ecological limit to growth. And this is ideally where you would settle at your steady state economy. You'd grow, there's nothing wrong with growth up to a point. Growth between 0 and GDP star would be economic growth. You'd reach this level of GDP and you'd stop. That's where you max it. Why? Because you won't want to go beyond GDP star, because it will just lower your economic welfare. It will reduce the gap between benefits and costs. You want to maximise that. So that's sometimes referred to as the optimal scale, for want of a technical term. An optimal scale of economic activity. I've just drawn a line in here arbitrarily, but to indicate that this would be, now remember I said that if your ecological footprint exceeds your biocapacity, which it is now, you've got an unsustainable economy. If it's less than your biocapacity, you're still sustainable. If the two are equal, you're just sustainable. That's the maximum sustainable scale of the economy. So I'm just assuming here that GDP at this level would be a GDP that would require a level of resource use where ecological footprint is equal to biocapacity, meaning that GDP beyond that level would be unsustainable. Obviously more GDP would mean more resources, everything else held constant. And if that is a GDP where ecological footprint is equal to biocapacity, then an economy of GDP beyond that would be ecological footprint greater than biocapacity. On this side, it would be less than biocapacity. So any scale size of GDP between here and there is sustainable. But that's the most desirable one. They might all be sustainable, but that's the one you want. You don't want that one because you're better off here. you want to avoid going beyond GDP-S sustainable. Unfortunately, as we know, as I showed in the diagram, the global economy is somewhere out here. It's about 70% higher than what is sustainable. It's 1.7 times. The ecological footprint is 1.7 times biocapacity. So it's out over here somewhere. So the global economy is well beyond the maximum sustainable scale, and as you could imagine, it's well beyond the optimal scale. Right, so economic welfare at the global level would not be as high as it possibly could be. All right. So let's say we settle at that level of GDP. Remember the GDP where the economic welfare is maximised? Okay, there's an indicator. Oh, perhaps I neglected that. Did I talk about? No, I didn't. Oh, okay. Just going back. Economic welfare is, best measured by, there is an indicator, it's called the Genuine Progress Indicator. I don't know if people are aware of this. It's an alternative to GDP. The GPI counts benefits, the major benefits of economic activity, counts the major costs, just subtracts the costs from the benefits and gives you a measure of economic welfare. That's why you would have probably wondered what this GPI. So GPI represents economic welfare. This indicator represents the level of economic welfare. And I've got to start here because that's where the GPI or economic welfare would be maximised. So let's say we grow the economy, we stop here. This is where we settle our steady state economy at that level of GDP to maximise the GPI. So let's say we do that, and that's here. All right, and there's our benefit curve initially, B0, and there's our cost curve, C0, and there is our GPI that we would experience, the economic welfare. Okay, now those curves aren't static. If we do desirable things, we can shift the benefit curve up. So a desirable shift of the benefit curve will be an upward shift. That would mean we'd be getting more benefits for every dollar of GDP that we're generating. And we can also do things that can lower, say, more efficient use of resources, moving towards renewables, which reduce greenhouse gas emissions and so forth, would lower the cost. So we can shift the cost curve down. If we do desirable things, it's also possible for the curves to go in the wrong direction. If you do things badly, right? It's quite possible for the benefit curve to shift inwards and the cost curve to shift upwards, which of course would narrow the gap between the two and reduce economic welfare. So you can see that if you settle at that level of GDP and you do desirable things, which shift the benefit curve up and lower the cost curve, you can see that you can experience more economic welfare without having to grow GDP. Economic welfare can be increased within a steady state economy. You don't need to grow the economy to grow economic welfare. In fact, as we've seen, I know this with static curves, if you grow the GDP beyond the optimal scale, the gap between benefit and cost narrows and your economic welfare falls. So GDP, the growth in GDP can actually lower economic welfare. You don't need to grow the GDP to increase economic welfare. I'll just very briefly talk about the sorts of things that might shift the benefit curve upwards. All right, what sorts of things would shift the benefit curve upwards? Well, improving the quality of goods consumed. I mentioned before, you've got the same quantity of goods, which you would have if you had the same GDP, but they're of better quality, I think you'll be better off. So better quality goods would increase or shift the benefit curve up, because that means you get more benefits for every dollar of GDP that you generate. Improving the quality of benefit yielding infrastructure. So a lot of the stuff that we produce isn't just household goods, it's the infrastructure that we use from day to day. Improving the quality of that will also increase or shift the benefit curve up. Reducing income inequality, for the reasons I just mentioned before. How a rich person, an extra $100 worth of consumption for a rich person doesn't add as much to that person's well-being as an extra $100 of consumption for a poor person. So if you've got a steady state economy, you're basically going to have the same level of consumption overall across the population. But if you narrow the gap between rich and poor, basically what will happen, you will narrow the gap, the income gap between rich and poor, you will narrow the consumption gap, which would mean the rich would consume a bit less. Well, if a rich person doesn't gain much more from an extra $100 worth of consumption, they don't lose much more when they get $100 less of consumption. All right, so if overall consumption is the same, but the rich consume less, and that doesn't affect their well-being much at all, but you give that consumption to the poor, who gain significantly from the same increase in consumption as there is a fall in consumption for the rich, the total welfare contribution of all consumption goes up without having to grow society's consumption. Just by redistribution, you get a greater welfare contribution of consumption. So reducing income inequality can shift the benefit curve up. Reducing various social costs also can help reducing labour underutilisation, cost of unemployment and so forth, and other social costs like overwork, crime, family breakdown. Reducing or shifting the cost curve down, well, anything that has a positive environmental impact will lower or shift the cost curve down. So that would be increasing the technical efficiency of production. In other words, reducing the amount of resources that you use to produce a dollar's worth of gross domestic product, GDP. Or in the nature of the resources we use to reduce the harmful impacts of the inevitable waste generated. So when we use resources to produce goods and services, that eventually becomes waste. There's nothing we can to avoid that. Resources going into the economy, exit eventually as waste. But depending on what sorts of resources we use determines the nature of the waste that exits the economy. So if we use coal, some of that waste is CO2. If it's renewable, it's not CO2. So we can alter the nature of the mix of the resources that enter the economy, so we alter the mix of the waste. So, if we move towards renewables rather and away from non-renewables, fossil fuels, then that would reduce CO2 emissions. That would also shift the cost curve down. Increasing the durability of physical goods. If you increase the durability of physical goods, they don't wear out as quickly. It means you don't have to produce as much to replace goods that become waste. Remember, all goods eventually wear out. Well, if they're more durable, they don't wear out as much. Right? So less becomes waste. It means less has to be produced to keep the overall stock constant. So improving or increasing the durability of physical goods and boosting the recycling rate of waste materials can also shift the cost curve down. And just reducing the ecological damage associated with exploitation of natural capital. So perhaps that's not a good term, but we exploit natural capital. If we want timber, we have to cut down a tree. We have to exploit a forest. Well, there are ways and means of doing it. If you want 5 logs in a hectare, can you take out the 5 logs and burn the whole lot? Can you do it selectively and reduce the ecological impact? Of course you can. So you can reduce ecological. If you're mining, is it always necessary to have an open cut mine? I'm not a geologist and what have you, but in many cases it may be possible to go underground. And therefore you can leave, if there's native vegetation on top, you can leave that intact, rather than an open cut mine where everything goes. So there are more sensitive ways you can extract resources, which would also mean that extracting the same quantity of resources lowers environmental impact. That would also lower the cost curve. So that's ways and means that you can shift the benefit curve up, lower the cost curve, so when you're at a steady state economy, you can still experience increases in economic welfare. There are many ways we can do that. We don't have to grow the economy to be better off. Okay, I'm just going to show you, this might interest you, some GPI results. Remember that the Genuine Progress Indicator? That was the measure of economic welfare. So this is for Australia. I don't have a lot of time, so I might just only show Australia. Now, the red line represents, so this is 1970 to 2016. Just the way that is, a 2016, that didn't come up. The red line represents Australia's per capita GDP. And the blue line is Australia's per capita GPI. Now, you might want to ask the question, why was it higher than GDP here? Well, one of the interesting things about the GPI is that it includes the informal economy. By the informal economy, I'm talking about unpaid household labour, volunteer labour and so forth, which provide services, which are useful, they're beneficial. GDP doesn't count that. So GDP is a very good measure of the volume of economic output, but doesn't tell you anything about the economic welfare being generated by the total economy. And by the total economy, I'm talking about formal and informal. So it just so happened that at this particular point in time, when we throw in the informal economy, Australia's per capita GPI was higher than per capita GDP in 1970. But the important thing is that you can see that per capita GPI does not increase at anywhere near the same rate as per capita GDP. I've got a few others here, but I think the one that's most important, given that I wanted to say that GDP as it increases doesn't necessarily improve your well-being in any spectacular way. Qatar just happens to be, or in 2016, even though there was a slight fall in its per capita GDP, red line being per capita GDP, was the richest country on earth in per capita terms. It had a per capita GDP of about $118,000. Australia's was about $45,000. But you can see it's per capita GPI. That doesn't translate necessarily into, and in fact, that I have to redo that calculation. That is likely to be lower. When I calculated the GPI for Australia, if I applied it to Qatar, that would probably be a bit lower. But you can see that this massive increase in per capita GDP doesn't necessarily translate to increase in economic welfare. All right, so just to 5 minutes, just to try and finish this off. How do we make the transition to a steady state economy? Well, as I pointed out, we are successfully reducing tea to some extent, at the global level. We've got to do something about P&A. It's the rise in P&A that's causing the environmental impact to go up. It's causing the ecological footprint to rise, and the gap between ecological footprint, the deficit, the gap between ecological footprint and biocapacity at the global level to rise. So we have to do something about P&A. Stabilising P. I don't want to talk too much about, as I said before, this is more controversial than stabilising A. The general view is that P is best stabilised by increasing A, per capita GDP. And that's referred to as the demographic transition. And that's based on the idea that wealthy people have lower fertility rates. So, I mentioned that the countries that need to reduce their population most are the poor, high population growth countries. That may be, that is the case, but it's argued that the reason why they have high population growth rates, they have high fertility rates, and that's because they're poor. So if we make them rich, they'll have fertility rates like we have in Australia, and that will help to reduce population growth. There's a problem, of course, with that. Okay, firstly, I showed you that per capita gross world product has more than doubled between 1961 and 2014, yet population is still rising. So A has been rising and population hasn't been falling. So that's a problem. Also, if you're relying upon rising per capita GDP to lower population, or to limit population growth, basically what you're doing is you're relying on one problem, the increase in A. You want to actually lower A, but you're relying on one problem to resolve another. Okay, so that's a problem in itself. The other thing is that the demographic transition, even if it turns out to be successful in limiting global population, it's a very slow process. Very, very slow. And so the question is, can we wait for the demographic transition to stabilise P? Can we wait for that? If it takes 50 years, another 50 years. And if it means global population stabilises at 11 or 12 billion, with probably a lot higher per capita gross world product. So a lot higher A. So P, that would mean P would be a lot higher again, that would be another 50% again. And A might be another 50% again. So that would require enormous reductions in T just to stop the ecological footprint from rising. And we need it to fall. It's currently 70% higher than the global biocapacity. Of course, then there's talk about planning, service access to contraception and gender equality. Allowing women to control their bodies would help lower the fertility rate and so forth. I'm not going to say anything more than that, okay? What about stabilising A? That was about stabilising P. Well, okay, imagine you've got a person who's gaining weight. I could have put he or she, but I'll put he. He is, sorry, I'm not trying to be gender specific, but because he is consuming more calories than he's burning off. Okay. How would you stabilise that person's weight? Well, you'd stabilise that person's weight by limiting the cause of the weight gain at its source. You would restrict the person's calorie intake. Well, the same goes with the economy. So even though we have to do something about GDP, you don't target GDP directly. You don't say, okay, we've got to lower GDP. What you do is you starve the economy to some extent. You limit, because to produce the GDP, we need resources. So if you want to limit how much GDP you produce, you want to limit the gain in weight that a person's experiencing, you limit how much food they consume. You limit the amount of resources that enter the economy. So we do the same thing with the economy. We must limit the input in resources, which would also limit waste levels, and ideally we would limit that so we get the ecological footprint so that it's no greater than biocapacity. That would limit GDP, and if we made sure we did it in such a way, just a minute or two, so the ecological footprint was no greater than biocapacity, the economy would again be sustainable. It would again be sustainable. So I think this is my last slide, because in conclusion, just to finish off, we should not target GDP, A, directly. We do want to lower A. I said we have to lower A, but we do it indirectly by imposing caps. We need to. Now these caps would not be determined by the market. Now the problem with relying upon the market is that the market doesn't take into account a lot of environmental values, and even if you make the market work better, and you can do that with things like taxes, so you can, if you want to lower the rate of depletion, you may introduce depletion taxes or pollution or carbon emissions. You might have carbon tax. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have a price on carbon, but you can't rely entirely upon a price on depletion through a tax or a price on pollution, because what the market does, if you can get it to work effectively, is it's good at lowering T, but it does nothing to reduce P and A. It does nothing to reduce or limit the rise in GDP. So you need to go outside the market and impose caps on the quantity of resources being used, which of course in turn indirectly imposes a cap on the waste that's generated. So that would reduce the resource intake of the economy, thus reducing GDP indirectly. And of course, if they're going to be caps, you would have caps designed, or a system designed in such a way that people would have a permit to pollute. I know that sounds horrible, but we're going to have production, we're going to use resources, there is going to be pollution. The issue is how much pollution, how many resources. You can't reduce it to zero. Okay, we can. I could reduce my resource intake to zero and my waste, I die. Okay, I can do that. I'm going to have to consume. It's a matter of how much I consume, how much waste I generate. Right? So you would auction off these rights, and that would generate a price, which would provide an incentive. That's where you get your carbon price. You set the cap on carbon emissions, you get the polluting companies to buy the rights to use the resources that generate emissions, and they have now an incentive to reduce their emissions per dollar of output that they generate. And then the tax revenue can be used to lower income tax rates on poor people, so you can have a more equitable distribution of income and wealth. Remember, distribution is going to be very important in a steady state economy. And that's it. Sorry, I've gone about a minute or two over.
Clarification and a friendly disagreement on one point, but first I want to say thanks for a fantastic presentation. The clarification is, your cost curves, do they include externalities, all costs, or are they just monetary costs, direct prices?
They do as best to include all costs, and of course you have to make an assumption about what the cost. So a lot of those environmental costs, I'm not using market prices, because in a lot of cases the market doesn't cost environmental damage at all. So I've used various studies. So by the way, my GPI calculations are very conservative. All right, people who are in favour of growth don't like the GPI, so I try to keep them off my back as much as possible by being as conservative as possible. If I really calculated them as I think they should be calculated, the GPI for Australia on a per capita basis probably didn't increase over that 46-year period between 1970 and 2016. But yeah, I use other studies. So studies when it comes to the cost of CO2 emissions, I use the lower bound cost for a tonne of CO2 emissions in my study.
Okay, the friendly disagreement is with your statement and affluence.
Yeah. Well, I did say that if for countries like Australia and Canada, which still have a reasonably high rate of population, they should do. I was just saying that for a country like Italy or Japan, it's not an issue. Or maybe they want to reduce their population. Well, so, but I guess I'm saying, and of course, the fact that the rich countries, Australia need to concentrate on A and P. I agree with you, and I did mention that. But for a country like Japan, they really only have to concentrate on A, because their population has stabilised, or maybe they want it to even fall. But A is still important because for the reasons you've just given. If A is still rising, it means that the effect of an increase in P in a rich country is greater. For the reasons you've just yeah. So I don't want to give the impression that rich countries should just ignore population. A country like Australia should definitely be thinking about population growth, but it's less of an issue for a country like Italy, where that's virtually zero population growth. It's less of an issue. If it raised its head again, then it would have to become an issue, of course. But yeah, so I guess I was just trying to say that, out of the P and the A, that the P is more important for the majority of countries will be in the poor group, less so in the rich group. With the case of A, it's, well, the rich countries are going to do something about suppressing A, the poor countries need to do more.
One of the traditional reasons for promoting annual growth is to control the unemployment rate. Could you say a few words about employment and unemployment in a steady state economy?
Okay, that's the $64 million question.
Nice, easy one.
I'd need another 50-minute presentation on that. When I was doing my PhD 15 years ago, I was critical of ecological economists because they kept talking about the need to move to a sustainable economy, which was great. And equity is an important component of ecological economics, but there seemed to be nothing about what it might mean in terms of unemployment, because the conventional view is that economies have got to grow, or GDP's got to grow at about 2 or 3% per year just to prevent the unemployment rate from increasing. So if you're going to limit the rise in GDP, doesn't that mean that unemployment's going to go through the roof? There are various ways you could do it. You could do it through work sharing. One of my concerns is, and you hear a lot of talk about, and I know this is a somewhat separate issue, but there's a lot of concern about automation. In fact, well, I'm one of these who believes that automation's been going on for 300 years, so why this is all of a sudden... And when I was in my teens, in the late 70s, I was told, you won't really get a job, Phil, because we're moving to computers and so forth. So this sort of raises... I'm not worried about automation, because what automation generally does is it increases the productivity of labour. It means that for an hour's labour, you get more output. The reason why we have a problem with automation at present is what happens to the productivity gains. Who's benefiting from the productivity gains? And if you go and have a look at a diagram which shows what's happened to real wages in Australia and what's happened to labour productivity in Australia, they basically both tracked each other till about 1983, which was a critical year, prices and incomes accord. So all this stuff about no wages, you go right back to 1980, and it was a Labor government that introduced it. And there's been a massive gap that's been growing between the increase in labour productivity and increase in real wages. So basically all the gains of labour productivity have gone to capital, which means that workers have to work just as long. Now, one of the great benefits of increasing labour productivity is that you should get increasing real wages, so you don't have to work as many hours per week to enjoy the level of income that you can have to enjoy a good life, which would mean we could employ just as many people with the same GDP, we've just worked fewer hours per week. So that's my concern. So again, that's distribution.